What happened to Japanese kamikaze pilots after the war? What if I told you that many Japanese kamikaze pilots, whom people usually imagine as men who flew off to die with no return, actually survived? And that for them, the hardest part did not begin in the skies over the Pacific, but after the war, when the country they had been taught to die for suddenly no longer needed people like them. They came home not as heroes in the usual sense, but as living reminders of catastrophe. They had been raised in a culture of duty and self-sacrifice, and then they found themselves in a new Japan, devastated, demilitarized, and forced to learn how to live again without war. And there is one terrifying paradox in this story. For many surviving kamikaze pilots, the real battle began only after surrender. Kamikaze, not a myth, but a desperate wartime measure. Today, kamikaze are often remembered as a symbol of fanaticism and Japan's final desperate act in World War II. Popular culture preserves the image of a young pilot boarding his plane with only one thought in mind: to crash into an enemy ship and die. But the reality was far more complicated. Kamikaze were not an ancient tradition, nor simply some supposed Japanese tendency toward death, as the subject is often oversimplified. They were used on a large scale only in 1944 to 1945, when Japan was already losing control of the sea and the air. Young pilots from the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army, cadets, and sometimes men who had gone through accelerated training were sent into these units. Yes, some went willingly, but others were pushed by discipline, propaganda, and fear of shame. Refusal was almost impossible. Historians, including Emiko Ohnuki-Tierney, emphasize that kamikaze were not the product of some eternal culture of death, but of a specific military catastrophe in which the state made self-sacrifice part of its official logic. Do you know what is truly shocking? Not all kamikaze died. Some missions were canceled at the last minute. Some pilots never returned because of technical failure, and others survived simply because the war ended before their final sortie. August 1945, when the whole world collapsed. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, a moment of total collapse began for the surviving kamikaze. The empire they had been taught to serve unto death was gone. Cities were in ruins. The economy had been destroyed. The military system that had promised them a sacred death suddenly no longer existed. For these men, surrender was not just something heard on the radio. It was a personal zero point. They had to figure out how to live in a country where there was no longer any need for combat flights, deadly loyalty, or the ideology in which they had been raised. Japan now needed workers, engineers, teachers, farmers, mechanics, and officials. People who could help rebuild life from scratch. But former kamikaze pilots were often not prepared for that, because all through their youth they had been taught just one formula: to die was to fulfill your duty. And now they were suddenly expected to do something entirely different. Be patient, work ordinary jobs, and quietly survive. Here is the main paradox. People trained for heroic death became almost useless in peacetime. Their skills no longer had value. Going home, that was not really a return. Many survivors returned to their towns and villages. But this return was rarely joyful. Sometimes families were genuinely relieved that a son had survived, but often there was too much pain around them. Friends, comrades, classmates, and neighbors had died. And in the shadow of that loss, the fact that you had survived could feel almost like the wrong outcome. Some former kamikaze stopped talking about their past altogether. They hid the fact that they had served in special attack units and never told their children or neighbors. And this was not only about shame. Often, it was silence for self-protection. The question, why did you survive and not him, is one that cannot be answered without pain. Post-war Japan also did not immediately know how to talk about such men. The country needed to distance itself from militarism. But at the same time, millions of families were grieving. As a result, former kamikaze found themselves caught between two reactions. On one side, they could be pitted as victims of the system. On the other, they could be seen as living reminders of a horrifying era. And that silence became a second trauma for many. The hardest thing for some survivors was not the past, but the future. They returned to a world where no one wanted to hear their story. What did they do after the war? After 1945, Japanese aviation had been effectively destroyed and heavily restricted. Military aviation no longer existed in its former form, so only a few were able to return to the skies. Some former military pilots later found work in civil aviation, but that was the exception rather than the rule. Most had to start over in completely different fields. Some became mechanics, workers, traders, farmers, teachers, office employees, or owners of small businesses. And here the cruelty of war becomes especially clear. Men who had just been part of an elite fighting machine were suddenly forced to struggle for ordinary life, for food, for work, and for the right to be unnoticed. Not everyone adapted quickly. Some adjusted, some never fully did. But for many, the same thought remained. The past could not be restored, and the peaceful future had nothing in common with what they had been taught. Ordinarily, kamikaze are imagined as men who did not want to live. But post-war testimony often shows the opposite. After the war, many of them wanted nothing more than to live a normal life. Survivor's guilt. What would not let them go for decades? One of the hardest issues is the psychological condition of those who survived the war. Many surviving kamikaze developed what we would now call survivor's guilt. They had been taught that the highest honor was to die for the country. So the very fact that they remained alive could feel wrong, almost shameful. For a person raised in an ideology of sacrifice, peacetime became a painful question without an answer. He keeps breathing, working, eating, speaking, but inside, the same voice may keep asking, why was I the one who remained? In interviews, memoirs, and oral testimonies of former pilots, this theme appears again and again. Unease, inner rupture, a sense of incompleteness, shame before the memory of dead comrades. All of this stayed with them for decades. That is why many of them could not simply leave the war in the past. It continued inside them. War's paradox in one sentence. In a country that had taught them to die without hesitation, surviving kamikaze often felt less like heroes and more like people who had not fully fulfilled their duty. How did society treat them? After the war, Japan began a painful reevaluation of its entire militarist past. Schools, the press, state institutions, and culture gradually moved away from imperial ideology. But the memory of kamikaze did not disappear. It simply became controversial. Who were they really? Victims of propaganda? Volunteers? Fanatics? Tragic young men sacrificed by the system? Or symbols of what happens when a state is built around a cult of death? There is no single answer. That is why former kamikaze lived in a society where they could be respected, pitted, avoided, or misunderstood all at once. Some of them later began speaking publicly about their experiences in schools, museums, memorial events, interviews, and documentary projects. For some, it was a way to finally break the silence. For others, it was an attempt to warn younger generations about how easily a state can exploit youth and idealism. In their stories, one shared idea appears again and again. They were very young. Many did not fully understand what was happening. They were taught not to doubt, not to argue, not to be afraid. And then they had to live with the consequences of other people's decisions. If you think about it, this is one of the cruelest paradoxes of war. The state demands absolute sacrifice from young people and then leaves them alone to deal with the consequences. Were there those who did not see themselves as victims? Yes, and that is also an important part of the story. Not all surviving kamikaze saw themselves only as victims. Some retained a more complex relationship with their past for the rest of their lives. For them, service could remain a matter of honor, even if it ended tragically. They might regret the war, but not completely abandon the sense of duty they had grown up with. This matters because the history of kamikaze does not fit into a simple scheme. It is not just the story of manipulated boys or fanatics. The reality was far more complicated. Some sincerely believed in the ideals of the era. Some obeyed pressure. Some dreamed of flying and were drawn into the machinery of war. Some spent the rest of their lives trying to understand who they had really been. That is why the subject of kamikaze still causes debate. There is too much pain in it and too few simple answers. And now a question for you. If someone was raised from childhood to die, can you really call their choice free? What has become of their memory today? Over time, kamikaze became part not only of war history, but of memory itself. In some contexts, they are remembered as tragic young men who became victims of militarism. In others, as symbols of how a state can drive a society into self-destruction. In still others, as an example of how ideology can replace human life with an abstract notion of duty. Some former pilots lived to old age and became important witnesses of the era. Their stories were used in books, films, interviews, and museum projects. And each time, the picture became more complex, less myth, more human being. Perhaps that is the main conclusion of their post-war fate. They did not become the legends that wartime propaganda tried to make of them, and they did not vanish completely into darkness. They stayed alive with memories that could never be fully erased. The long shadow of war. For some of these men, the war never really ended in their minds. Even decades later, certain sounds, smells, or images could bring the past back with brutal force. The roar of an engine, the sight of a uniform, the sound of a military song. These things could reopen memories that had never fully healed. Japan's post-war peace was real, but for many survivors, it was not simple peace of mind. They lived through reconstruction, economic recovery, the rise of a new generation, and the transformation of their country into something unrecognizable from the world they had once known. Yet inside, many remained trapped between two eras: the wartime Japan they had been shaped by, and the post-war Japan that expected them to quietly move on. Some carried the burden of not only their own survival, but also the memory of friends who never returned. In a society that was trying to rebuild, there was often little room for such grief. People want to look ahead, not backward. They wanted work, stability, and normal life. But for the survivors, normal life itself was often the hardest thing to learn. Because how do you become ordinary again when your youth was organized around death? Memory, silence, and the need to speak. In the decades after the war, a few surviving kamikaze pilots began to speak publicly. They gave lectures, appeared in documentary films, visited schools, and shared memoirs or interviews. Not all of them did so for the same reasons. Some wanted to apologize. Some wanted to remember the dead. Some wanted to explain how young men could be swept into a system that turned death into duty. And some simply did not want their own experiences to disappear into silence. Their testimonies became especially important because they complicated the public image of kamikaze. They showed that the people behind the symbol were not abstract figures from propaganda posters, but frightened, hopeful, confused, dutiful, and deeply human young men. Many had been teenagers or very young adults. They had dreams, fears, and futures that were interrupted. Some wanted to study. Some wanted to fly. because they loved aviation. Some believed their sacrifice would protect their families. Some just wanted to survive each day without disobeying the system around them. When those voices finally emerged, they forced people to confront a painful truth. War does not only kill bodies, it also reshapes memory, identity, and the meaning of survival itself. Conclusion. So what happened to Japanese kamikaze pilots after the war? Some died in combat. Some never made it into the air. But those who survived found themselves in a world that no longer needed the role they had once been trained for. They returned to a ruined Japan, where they had to learn how to live again, work again, remain silent, remember, and sometimes speak. Their lives took different paths, but almost all of them shared one thing. For them, the war did not end in August 1945. It continued internally as guilt, lost youth, a broken identity, and the memory of those who never returned. The story of Kamikaze is not only a story about death. It is a story about what happens to people after a state has used them to the limit. And that is why it still feels so heavy today.